Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner. We have been doing this series on the trauma of transition, which means trauma that can and sometimes is associated with individuals who are transitioning from one way of life to another. And so we're going to deal with part 4 today. And part 4 has a simple topic entitled, I Need Help. But before we begin to look at this aspect of the trauma of transition, it's essential that we revisit what we've learned thus far. So let's get right into this here. I need help. Don't we all? Well, we're going to look at those who would need help, those who are struggling, those who are in trauma as it relates to transitioning. We're going to look at some things to give us a better picture and touch on some solutions that may help us to move from one place in thought and life to the next. The last time we were together, those of you who have been following this series and those who just recently joined us have learned that there can be trauma in transitioning, especially from one lifestyle to another. Last time, we looked at the attachment theory to try to provide a theoretical framework as to why some people are just stuck. Sometimes when we, are trying to understand something, we can not have a theoretical term or some academic term, and we can just say, this person is stuck and I want to know why. But it is helpful to understand from a theoretical or an academic standpoint as to why people are stuck. Because those who have come up with these theories and those who are academicians and have done this kind of research have found out some emerging themes or some common themes that are associated with people as to why they are just stuck. And so the last time we looked at the attachment theory, we wanted to provide this theoretical framework. We learned that many of the most intense emotions arise during the formation and maintenance, the disruption, and renewal of attachment relationships. Threat of loss arouses anxiety, and actual loss gives rise to sorrow. And there we kind of drew from Bowlby, who in a lot of his research, some of his research was associated with mourning, and to try to understand why it's difficult for people who've had these long-term relationships with individuals, and to try to understand this connection and how to help people make this process when that person is no longer here. Well, this same attachment theory has applied to relationships, especially relationships that, however, you need to move away from onto another kind of relationship. And so as a result of that, intense emotions are formed. Maintenance will also have those emotions to remain in an intense state. But when it comes to disruption, you're going to find that same intense emotion and renewal when you rebonded or you reunited with that person again. When any of these things are threatened, when that attachment is threatened, it arouses some form of anxiety, and it also, when the actual loss occurs, there is a deep sense of sorrow. And we've seen this throughout this teaching, we've seen this throughout this series, and we're going to look at it just a little bit further. The last time we were together, we also visited the Stockholm Syndrome. And From a historical perspective, we gained how some people favor their oppressor, especially after being held captive for a period of time. This condition is a result of a psychological bond that has developed between hostages and their captors during captivity. And one of the classic cases of the Stockholm Syndrome was the Patty Hearst story. Now, we're not going to go into the Patty Hearst story, but you can go and do your research and find out, how Patty Hearst relates to the idea of the Stockholm Syndrome. The Stockholm Syndrome, as it's noted here, is a condition that is a result of a psychological bond that is developed between hostages and their captors during captivity. This psychological bond is not just with individuals, but as we will see in some subsequent series and some subsequent teachings and lessons around this idea here, we find that this psychological bond is can not only be to a person, but it can also be a psychological bond to a political worldview or a religious worldview. There are other things or maybe even something more deeper as to a global perspective as it relates to how people that are oriented in one particular society, and when they're brought over to another society, how it's difficult for them to make that separation, and how we can look at people that have been in captivity for long periods of time, such as the children of Israel, who were 400 years in this particular dilemma. We can also look at those who were brought over through the slave trade, and Africans that are brought over through the slave trade, and right here in America had 400 years in this type of captivity. There is a correlation between those 400 years that Israel spent in slavery and the impact and the 400 years that slaves have experienced, that has passed on through generation and through some sort of collective trauma. We're not going to talk about that in this particular series because I want to spend some time to really break this down so we can understand some of the current dynamics and some of the strongest psychological bonds that we've seen in our lifetime. How do we get free? Well, one way to get free is to identify them. And we've identified them through the term of Stockholm Syndrome. But throughout this series, we've woven both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament into this lesson. To what? To further understand the psycho-spiritual impact that the trauma of transition can have on people of faith. So we've drawn some from the Old Testament and we've drawn some from the New Testament and woven it in so we can understand the psycho-spiritual impact that comes from the trauma of transition and how it definitely affects people of faith. Our primary passage for this series is Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 through 6. And it reads like this from the New Revised Standard Version. The rabble among them had a strong craving, and the Israelites also wept again and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. Now, the truths in this portion of Israel's story is a classic example of what we learn about the attachment theory and the Stockholm Syndrome and the trauma of transition. Israel, at this particular juncture, they had forgotten about their oppression. Yet there was a rabble among them that was craving what they used to have, craving what they used to participate in, craving what was their life in bondage. And they remembered that. That's what they longed for because that's what they were used to. Israel had forgotten about their oppression. In essence, their lives under oppression had become normalized. This is what they expected. This life, that is, the life they had in oppression, the life they had in bondage, was predictable. They knew what their slave master wanted, and they did what their slave master stated. The slave master said jump, and those in captive said how high. Their lives under oppression had become normalized. This was expected. This life was predictable. This life, although uncouth, but it became their comfort zone. So sometimes, that which is uncouth becomes a zone of comfort. And for Israel, that which was uncouth, that is the life that they had, in this, demonized, as it were, bondage. It was uncouth, but it was their comfort zone. They had become like mice in a controlled experiment, and to venture beyond that resulted in trauma. The trauma associated with transition. Well, Israel, if you follow the story in Numbers, as we jump over to Numbers 14, verses 1 through 4, we will see that Israel's had progression in transitional trauma. Their transitional trauma had progressed. In other words, that which was developing had begun to fester and that began to spread. Well, let's look at this story. If we read Numbers 14, 1 through 4, it says, "Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, 'Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become booty. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?' So they said one to another, 'Let's choose a captain and go back to Egypt.'" Now, if you know the story, this story this part of the story is after God had begun to give Moses, some directives. I'm going to give you this land of promise. But what I want you to do, my instructions are very clear. I want you to take 12 leaders, take them from one leader from each tribe, and dispatch them into this land that I am going to give you. And what I want you to do is to have them to report back, what the land is like. And that was their assignment. So they sent these 12 spies out to go spy out the land. And when they got there, they began to see their stature. They began to see the fruit. They began to see the scenario. They did reconnaissance and they brought back report to Moses. However, in their reporting, 2 of them had a good report, but the other 10 leaders came back with an evil report. Those 10 leaders said, "We are like grasshoppers in their sight." But the 2 leaders that came back with the good report says, Let us go up at once, for we can take them. And so you can see the perception and you can see the struggle. Israel had already been struggling all along with this transitional trauma. And now that God has brought them to a place to where they are going to see the land that he had promised them, we find this rabble had affected leadership, had affected their view that their view of what was old over against what is new, their view of what was Pharaoh's over against that which was Yahweh's. Even after God had told them to spy out the land, their struggles with letting go of what they were used to plagued Israel to the point that those poisoned by this faction in leadership, guess what? Were not permitted to enter into the promised land, but died off in the wilderness. Be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. Remember what they said? Why is the Lord bringing us out of this land to fall by the sword? Or would it be that we died in this wilderness? That's exactly what they got, because that's exactly what they wanted, because they could not let go of what they used to have to embrace that which was being offered, that was fresh, vibrant, and new, which is going to take time to make that transition, because that transition is not just a physical one. It is also a mental one. It also goes beneath the surface. And that's why we looked at the attachment theory. And that's why we looked at that's why we looked at the Stockholm Syndrome, to try to understand how the mind of man can become so conditioned by its captors and the paradigm that the captors have created, that people kind of stay within those walls and they don't venture out. And it's easier to say, I'm going to stay right here and dig right in, rather than move on and follow on. In this case, to follow on to know the Lord. Well, I want to talk briefly about solutions for transitional trauma. Obviously, in this lesson, there is no way that I could talk about all the solutions. But I want to talk about one of the primary solutions that can help us break away from the past, break away from the old, and break into the new. Let us visit Romans 12:2 and step into the solution phase regarding the trauma of transition. Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Well, when we began to break down some of these words here in the New Testament, because the New Testament was written in Greek, so we need to go back to the Greek and try to get an idea of how this Greek word was used in their culture, and what idea that the writer is conveying about what needs to happen. He says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The word conformed is translated from the Greek word systematizo, which means conform to. And according to the Lexham Research Lexicon of the New Testament, it best translates this Greek word systematizo as to assimilate, be conformed, or to be or become behaviorally or socially similar to, conceived as of being or becoming shaped or molded to a certain pattern. Now, Wow. There's a whole lot that I could say about assimilation right now. And those who have been following this series and those who have been students of what we see going on in our society now understand what we mean here about assimilation. The writer here, which we assert to be Paul, the apostle, says, do not assimilate. Do not be conformed. Do not be or become behaviorally or socially similar to. Well, wait a minute now. That's trauma because this is all that I've ever known. And if it's all that I ever known, then how can I break away from what I've already known? You know, I'm encouraged to stay the same way I have always been. I'm encouraged to assimilate and to behaviorally and socially be similar to that particular paradigm or that particular way of thinking. Let's go on a little bit further. Be not conformed to this world. Well, the word world here is translated from the Greek word aeon, which means age. But particularly, it means evil age. A particular stage in history understood according to its values, beliefs, and morals in distinction to God's. So it's talking about the evil age, or the age in which, God's ideal is on one side and the ideals of this age are on the other. Look at it from what Israel experienced. They were under basically the bondage of Pharaoh, which was what? A type of demonic oppression, if you want to look at it from that perspective. They were brought out of that. They were basically, as a people, saved from that. Their salvation was to deliver them from that. And God wanted to bring them into a life and lifestyle to where they would no longer trust the small God that they see, God with a small g, whom they see, understood, and was oppressive, but trust the true and living God whom they could not see. To move from the values and beliefs and morals that they had become, or that they have adopted, or that had been passed on to them, to now embrace a whole new set of laws, a whole new paradigm, a whole new polity and doctrine, as it were, that came from the true and living God. Be not conformed to that which you came out of, but you got to identify that which you came out of is evil. And if I don't understand the evilness of that which I came out of, or the evilness of that particular paradigm and age or world, as it were, it's easier to say, I had it better off right there. Rather than rock the boat, I'm going to stay right here. Rather than bring some threat upon my life, I'm not going to make any shift. I'm not going to rattle the cage. I'm just going to comfort out right here, because it's better for me to remain right here than to move forward into something that I'm not sure of, that I have to trust, that I've got to move out of my comfort zone, that I've got to push the envelope, that I've got to believe something, even though I know it's true, but I've got to believe something that's going to require me to change. This evil age is a German word that we can refer to as Zeitgeist. It calls the spirit of the age. And that spirit of the age encompasses a lot of things when we talk about the life that we now live here in the 2020s, as it were. It also refers to an invisible agent or force dominating the characteristics of this given epoch in world history. So, that invisible agent or dominating force that you can't see, some have attributed that to the devil. Some have attributed it to the spirit, the very spirit of this age. There are a lot of things we can talk about that are zeitgeist, that are part of the spirit of this age. I'm going to mention one, but I'm not going to go into I'm not going to go into breaking all this down. But one of the spirit of this age that we are confronted with right here in America are those things which are called Americanisms. Things like the, American pie or, the American dream. All of that is part of the zeitgeist and what all that represents, how all that is played out into thought and also behavior can be explained and can be explained in such a way to where we have to ask this question: is the American pie or the American dream concurrent with God's vision? We'll talk about that at another time. Let's move on a little bit further as we begin to break down what this verse means. Be transformed, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The word transform is translated from the Greek word metamorphube, which means change or be transformed. It's a verb in its present and passive tense. Second person is also used there as a finite verb. To be transformed, it means to be or become changed in outward appearance or expression as manifesting a change in nature or essence. In other words, your outward appearance has been changed and influenced by that which is going on the inside. So, by the renewing of your mind, we look at the word renewing, which is anakinosis, which is renewal, is the act of reestablishing something in a like new or improved manner. So he didn't say throw your mind away. It says to basically refurbish it and renew it, to establish it in a like new and often improved manner. Like what we learned the last time about the new wineskin. They didn't go out and buy a brand new wineskin. They took that old wineskin and reconditioned it to the point that it could be used again. Let's not give up on our own minds. Our minds are still useful, but they have to be renewed. And from a Christian point of view, from a Christ followership point of view, the way we renew our minds is through the study of God's word. Now, obviously, that's very clear. But there are other aspects of renewing our mind. Is when we can identify the things that have kept me from progressing forward. Why do I behave the way that I behave? We can look at that. In order to change someone's behavior, you have to first change how someone thinks. Mind is very clear. It comes from Strong's 3563, which means the psychological faculty of understanding, reasoning, and making decisions. In the Dictionary of Biblical Languages with semantic domains, it means a way of thinking, an attitude. So I need to change the way that I think. So in order to overcome and navigate through the trauma of transition, I must be open and willing to learn something new, to receive new information. Why? This transformation is about changing something on the inside to affect change on the outside. Change the way of thinking and you change the way of living. Well, this concludes part 4 of the trauma of transition. Obviously, we're only scratching the surface here. But I wanted to just kind of leave you with this because we're going to make a transition as we go into this next piece that I want to spend a lot of time on. And we're going to pick up on some other solutions that I believe that will help us in the trauma of transition. But we need to identify certain pillars in our society and our globe that are influential factors that are keeping people held hostage. And people are beginning to like the lifestyle that they've gained in hostility, that they've gained as being captives. Some of us have grown up in this captivity and never known the difference. Other of us, We learned it through education. We learned it through other aspects. So this next series we're going to deal with is going to pick up from what we've already learned, but focus on some of the strongest strongholds in our society that makes it most difficult from transitioning. And we're going to add some solutions, talk some different way of life that can really help us make a difference, not just for my own life, but for our own life as Christ followers. Stick with us. We'll talk to you soon, right back here on Talking Points. God bless you. See you next time.